and we'll take you now to the live to the Texas Book Festival.
Introduce to you Mr. Gene Kranz. Gene is a legend. There is debate in Hollywood about who is more handsome, Gene or Ed Harris. I could tell you many things about him, but I suspect you already know who he is. But let me tell you two key facts. One, he was born in 1933 in Ohio, but he has lived in Texas for a considerable number of years. But more importantly, he met his lovely wife, Marta, who's sitting in the audience, in Del Rio, Texas. Again, I could say much about him, but let me just give you 4 words because they will define the man, and they are Apollo 11 and Apollo 13. Gene's career extends far beyond those 2 pivotal events in our history. And I am pleased to say that he has taken the trouble to write, and he will read from this marvelous book, which you have a chance to buy after he speaks in the tent, and he'd be happy to sign it for you. This is a bestseller, and it's appropriate and somehow fitting that men like Gene can write a book and can have it meet the standards of the bestseller list when we're in an era when NBA players with their drug addictions make the bestseller list every single day. So this is a true honor. I only want to conclude by saying that Ray Bradbury, a science writer and science fiction writer, once observed that in 1,000 years, as we are truly in space by then, the men and women of that time will look back to the era of the middle 20th century with some envy because we took the first steps. And one of those men who took the first steps is sitting next to me, and so my privilege is to introduce Gene Kranz.
Thank you very much, and it's a real pleasure to be in Austin today at the Texas Book Festival. I feel somewhat constrained here because I normally stand up and I'm an arm waver, so if I seem somewhat reserved today, it's because this is a somewhat different venue than I'm used to participating in. It's a real pleasure to talk today on the men and women of mission control at America's early space program. And before I go into a discussion of our early years, I'd like to read about 1.5 pages of my book. Houston, we have a problem. At some time in the hours that followed that terse announcement from Apollo 13, many of us in NASA's Mission Control Center wondered if we were going to lose our crew. Each of us had indelible memories of that awful day 3 years before, when 3 other astronauts sat in an Apollo spacecraft firmly anchored to the ground. We were running a systems test. It was routine. In terms of the distances involved in spaceflight, we could almost reach out and touch them. Moments after the first intimation that something had gone terribly wrong, technicians were up in the gantry, desperately trying to open the hatch. It took only seconds for an electrical glitch to ignite the oxygen-rich atmosphere of the cabin, creating a fire that was virtually a contained explosion. In those few seconds, the men inside the capsule knew what was happening, and they must have realized at the last moment that there was no escape. We simply could not reach them in time. Now, in Apollo 13, 3 equally brave men were far beyond us in distance, far out in the vast, absolute world of space, the most deadly and unforgiving environment ever experienced by man. We could measure the distance in miles, but with so many miles, the number was an abstraction, albeit one we had become used to dealing with in a matter-of-fact fashion. Once again, technology had failed us. We had not anticipated what happened back then on Earth. We had not anticipated what happened this time. In fact, it would be hours before we really understood what had happened. There was one big difference in this case. We could buy time. What we could not accomplish through technology or procedures and operating manuals, we might be able to manage by drawing on a priceless fund of experience accumulated over almost a decade of sending men into spaces far beyond the envelope of Earth's protective atmosphere. All we had to work with was time and experience. The term we use is workarounds, options, other ways of doing things, solutions to problems that weren't to be found in our manuals and schematics. These 3 astronauts now were beyond our physical reach, but not beyond the reach of human imagination, inventiveness, and a creed that we all lived by. Failure in our business is not an option. For me and for the others sitting safely in mission control, we could only depend on a learning curve that started at a place that wasn't more than a complex of sand, marsh, and new raw concrete and asphalt. It wasn't even Kennedy Space Center then, but it was our first classroom and laboratory. And all we had learned since those first uncertain years would be what we had to work with to figure out what had happened and what we must do about it. You know, when we first started in spaceflight, our world was vastly different. Our country was torn by the beginning of conflict in Southeast Asia. In that decade, we were to have 3 political assassinations, and the civil rights movement was just starting within our nation. The Cold War with Russia guided every aspect of our foreign policy, and it was the rationale for America's space program. Computers existed only in laboratories. There were no global communications, and in that decade, students would frequently riot on our campuses. And then in 1961, a young, brash, and articulate President John F. Kennedy gave us a dream. He said, we choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do other things, not because they're easy, but because they're hard. And he made this statement as we were struggling to put John Glenn in orbit. So engineers and people experienced in flight test and a small group of 31 Canadians and Englishmen joined with the Mercury 7 astronauts at Langley Field in Virginia to form a space task group. And our objective was to put an American in space. Our boss was Walt Williams. Walt was the toughest man I have ever known. He was a brawler. He was more fitted to working as a longshoreman in New York or San Diego than leading the American space program. But Williams, in the business of flight test, was a legend. He was the pioneer director of the high-speed test station that later became known as Edwards Air Force Base. He was the project engineer for the X-1 rocket ship that in 1947 took Chuck Yeager and the world into the age of supersonic flight. And Williams' deputy was appropriately named Christopher Columbus Kraft. He was the pioneer director in mission control. He launched each one of the Mercury missions, and he was the mentor, the teacher, the tutor for this first generation of young people that became known as mission controllers. Mercury Control did not have a single computer. There were 3 mainframe computers supporting all of Project Mercury. 2 of these were at Goddard Space Flight Center in Greenbelt, Maryland, very low serial numbers, like number 3 and 4 of the IBM 7090 series. And these were the first solid-state machines ever developed by IBM. And on the island of Bermuda, we had a reliable vacuum tube model, a Model 709. And we always launched eastward over the island such that if we lost communications in powered flight, we had a team in place who would tell the astronauts what to do when the engine shut down. Global communications consisted of a 60-word-per-minute teletype network that dated back to the days of America's Pony Express. So with a couple of weeks training in Morse code and speed printing and spacecraft systems, we sent young men to 13 tracking stations around the world. They went into the heart of Africa. They went to Australia. We put them in ships and sea and set them on islands in the Pacific. And the risks to these young people was very high because the 60s was the end of the European colonial era throughout the world. My controllers at Kano were twice rescued by the Nigerian army. And at Zanzibar, they'd go to work behind the rifles of the Queen's Royal Rifles of the British Highlander regiments. And when their work was done at the tracking stations, they'd bring them back to the quarters station, a gunner at the top of the stairs. But these young people were our eyes, our ears, and voice as the spacecraft passed overhead. And for their age, they were given incredible responsibilities, and they grew to be the leaders that we used in Project Apollo. When we first ventured into space in Project Mercury, and each one of our launches was a chapter in the history book of spaceflight. Our mistakes were violent, they were brutal, they were visible. 2 of our first 3 Atlas rockets exploded shortly after they left the launch pad. Then we launched our first Redstone rocket. We sent the firing command, the engine ignited, lifted 4 inches off the pad, then the engine shut down, and through some miracle, it landed back in the launcher ring. The escape tower fired, went up to an altitude of about 4,000 feet, and then came hurtling back down towards the viewing stand, and all the VIPs ran for cover. The booster engineers were speaking in German. We didn't understand what they were saying. We literally did not know what to do. But we were fortunate in those days because our nation understood there is no achievement without risk. And there certainly weren't any guarantees in this new business that was called spaceflight. Now, we put 6 Americans in space in our first 2 years, and there were close calls on every one of those missions, especially in John Glenn's and Scotty Carpenter's mission. But we got every one of our Mercury crew members back home. And by the time that we had finished with Project Mercury, we had learned that man could live in space, but we learned much more. We learned of leadership. Leaders must have integrity. They must say what they mean, and then they must go out and execute it. Leaders must accept risk, but they must never pass uncertainty to their people. We also learned a lot about ourselves because many of us came in from aircraft flight tests, and our egos were much bigger than this room, and it was really tough at times to get people to work together. But we found that success will only come through teamwork, so we would check our ego at the door every day we came to work, and we became a team. So we moved into Project Gemini. And Gemini was designed to develop and test and prove the kinds of technologies we needed to go to the moon. One of these technologies was with our method for trajectory design. Now, in Project Mercury, we had 2 very large groups of women, about 100 in number, and they were in what we called the math physics branch. And we called these women computers. Computers were people in those days, not machines. And we gave these women manual calculators, and they'd punch away at the numbers, and they'd pull the lever, the numbers would spin, then they'd write the answer down, they'd plot it in graph paper. And they would do this endlessly, day after day, just for a single Mercury mission. Well, this wasn't going to get us to the moon. It wouldn't even get 2 spacecrafts rendezvoused in Gemini. So they finally gave us computers, and each one of these machines was as big as a room. 5 of them filled the entire first floor in mission control, and even put a small computer on board the spacecraft. But the problem was, we had no computer experience. So we went to the colleges and the universities of our nation and brought in the young people who were working with computers in the laboratories. We went to the Army Missile Command at Fort Bliss in Texas and brought in the corporals and sergeants when they were discharged because the military was working with computers. And we took these new recruits and merged them with the Mercury veterans. And we started working on the very edge of all knowledge, all technology, and all experience. Now, when we first started off into space, the Russians had about a 2.5-year lead on us. But when Ed White stepped outside of his spacecraft in the Gemini 4 mission, we had now narrowed that lead down to mere months. And then, on the next 2 missions, for the first time, we set American manned spaceflight records. First for mission duration, and then we rendezvoused 2 spacecrafts. And with this rendezvous, we had developed the technologies and the confidence to use these technologies to continue our expansion in space. But we also learned more about ourselves. We learned discipline and absolute and unwavering focus upon our objective. Nothing must ever compromise our mission. We also found the value of high morale because we now knew we were succeeding because of our belief in our mission, in our team, and in ourselves. So we moved into the Apollo program. We were in the consoles Friday afternoon, January 27th, 1967. We were 1 month from launch, and we were testing the Apollo spacecraft. And the test that day hadn't been going very well. We had numerous problems in communications, and we had problems in life support. Test procedures were incorrect. We'd call a hold and a countdown. We'd write out the new test procedure and voice it to the test director and into the spacecraft. And we continued on. And at 6:31 that evening, we were startled by cries coming from the spacecraft, and we listened to our crew's cries for 12 seconds as they died. And with death came anger at ourselves because we were responsible for America's first space disaster. We wrote 2 more words into our vocabulary as mission controllers: tough and competent. Tough meaning we will never again shirk from our responsibilities. We are forever accountable for what we do or what we fail to do. Competent, we'll never again take anything for granted. We'll never stop learning. From now on, the teams in mission control will be perfect. And we designed the badge, the emblem of mission control. This is the current version of it. And this became the price for admission to our ranks: discipline, morale, competence, commitment, teamwork, toughness. This team must never fail again. Now, in our business, the boss is the flight director. I think he is well portrayed by Ed Harris in the movie. The flight director is the place where the buck stops, and his job description is very simple in America today. It's only one sentence long. The flight director may take any action necessary for crew safety and mission success. That's it. And during the course of a mission, the flight director is supported by a team of between 15 and 21 controllers. And there are people who specialize in the spacecraft systems and trajectories, and we have procedures writers and facility operators. And we have a astronaut who serves as a communications link between the ground team and the crew. And we also have a flight surgeon who looks after not only the crew's health in space, but after his flight control team. This young team, in July 20th, 1969, was sitting in the main room in Mission Control. And at late in the afternoon, we locked the doors in that control room. And we always go to what we call a battle short condition, where we basically secure the facility so that there will be no distractions to the controllers. No one can get into the room or out of the room. And when we locked those doors that afternoon, there were only three things that could happen. We would either land on the moon, we would crash, or we would abort the mission. And this team of young controllers, average age 26, began a battle to get the crew to the surface of the moon. And we literally fought all the way to get there. We had numerous problems in communications, and we had a navigation problem that was moving us downrange from the landing site. Minor electrical problems that were a distraction. These were followed by computer program alarms where the spacecraft was telling us it was too busy to do all of the work. And as we approached the lunar surface, we were running out of fuel. We finally landed and shut those engines down on the surface with less than 17 seconds of fuel remaining. But when we shut that engine down, and when the crew walked on the surface, and when we got that crew back home, we had fulfilled the pledge that we had made to our now dead president, John F. Kennedy. The dream had been concluded. We launched again, Apollo 12, this time in November, and as we left the launch pad, we were struck twice by lightning. And we had 3 crewmen inside a dead spacecraft hurtling up towards orbit. The only thing that was working for us was the booster guidance system and the booster propulsion systems. And again, Mission Control had a 2-minute window of opportunity to save that mission. Again, a young controller stepped forward, made the call to restore the instrumentation to the spacecraft, and with the instrumentation back, we could now go to work in the spacecraft systems. We assured that the reactant flow was still going into the fuel cells. We brought the fuel cells back online in the power system, and then we secured the navigation system. And in that 2-minute window of opportunity, we had saved the Apollo 12 mission. We checked the spacecraft out and injected them outward bound to the moon. And that mission turned to be very successful. So by the time we got to Apollo 13, this was our 3rd lunar landing mission now. The previous 2 missions had been very dicey, very sporty. And we were hoping for a change that everything would go well for us. 3 crewmen were Jim Lovell, Fred Hayes, and Ken Mattingly. Lovell and Hayes were the experts in the lunar module, and they were scheduled to descend to the moon's surface at the Frau Maurer landing site. Ken Mattingly was the expert in the command module. He'd remain with the mothership circling in lunar orbit. But 2 days prior to launch, Mattingly was scrubbed from the mission because he had been exposed to measles, and he was replaced by Jack Swigert, a member of the backup crew. The mission's run in trust. When you turn 7.5 million pounds of thrust loose, that is commitment. There's no change in your mind. There's no turning back. And we lost an engine in the 2nd stage of powered flight. We very rapidly took a look at the remaining engines. They were all go. We computed the new engine shutdown times, passed them up to the crew. The crew got into orbit. We checked the spacecraft out and sent them outward bound to the moon. So by the end of the 2nd day, this crew is now 200,000 miles from Earth. They're 50,000 miles from the surface of the moon. They're entering a phase of the mission. We use the term entering the lunar sphere of influence. My team happened to be on the console that day. We were just finishing up our 2nd shift, and everything was looking well on board the spacecraft. We had had a television broadcast from the crew in space, and their wives and families had been sitting behind me in the viewing room. And when the television broadcast was concluded, the families went home. The next team of mission controllers was reporting in for shift handover. And so the noise level in the room was building up, and their flight director, Glenn Lunny, was sitting next to me at the console. He was reading my log, preparing for handover. The final thing my team had to do was to get the crew to sleep. And we have a 5-page pre-sleep checklist we go through to make sure everything on board the spacecraft is properly configured. We're down to the last entry in that checklist, and it poses a question. Do we require a cryo stir? Now, the fuels that we use on board the spacecraft are cryogenic oxygen and hydrogen. That's super dense, super cold liquid packed in vacuum tanks at incredibly low temperatures of minus 300 and 400 degrees Fahrenheit. And they react in the fuel cells to provide electricity. They also provide pure water, and they provide heat. The oxygen also is used for breathing purposes and to pressurize the spacecraft. So these are enormously important consumables. By 2 days, however, it's no longer a super dense, super cold liquid, but it's now a thick, icy fog in the tank. And inside the tank, we have some fans we use to stir up this mixture to make it uniform so we can measure it. And we turn on a set of heaters in the tank to raise the pressure for the sleep period. Well, this is what we had asked the crew to do. And the crew acknowledged our request. Swigert did. Swigert looked behind him, and coming through the tunnel from the lunar module was Fred Hayes. And Swigert then threw the switches to initiate this fuel cell purge and the cryo stir. Nothing happened for about 16 seconds. And then inside oxygen tank 2, a spark jumped between the wires and the heater element, and the pressure in that tank rose very rapidly over the next 6 seconds until the dome of the tank blew off. And when the dome came off, the insulation surrounding the tank caught fire. It was like a blowtorch racing through the bay of the spacecraft, tearing out the instrumentation and the plumbing and the electrical systems until the pressure increased to the point where it blew the side of the spacecraft off. And when the side came off, the entire area surrounding the spacecraft was enveloped in a cloud of debris from the explosion and frozen particles of oxygen. Now, in mission control, we did not know an explosion had occurred. It's 55 hours, 55 minutes, and 4 seconds. The voice loops come alive. Hey, flight, we've had a computer restart. Another controller says main bus undervolt. Third one says antenna switch. And then down from the spacecraft, we hear a level call. Hey, Houston, we got a problem. Well, I believe you all know the remainder of the story. You've seen it well depicted in the movie. And I believe that the movie portrayed the events factually and accurately. They left several of the components out. There's several of the more difficult problems that I believe we had to face, one of which was picking the trajectory path back to Earth. It also had several techniques that we would have to come up with to navigate and to verify our attitude orientation prior to performing maneuvers. But I believe that the movie was a very good portrayal of the men and women of mission control and the kinds of work we do. Apollo 14 was a very interesting mission that I describe in the book. And how many of you work here in the area of software systems, possibly some of the hardware? Quite a few of you, I would imagine, yeah. Well, let me pose you a problem here that I'd like your solution on, and I'll tell you how mission control solved it. Apollo 14, as we're preparing to descend to the surface of the moon, one of my controllers, Dick Thorson, he's the guidance navigation control individual for the LEM spacecraft, looks up and all of a sudden he sees the abort light on in his panel. And he recognizes that at this point in the spacecraft preparation for landing, the abort indication should not be on. He rapidly consults with his backroom people, and he concludes that there may be a solder ball in the abort switch floating around in 0G. So he voices the instructions up to the crew to take their flashlight and tap on the instrument panel near the abort switch. And the crew does exactly that, and the abort light goes out. Okay? Thorson immediately calls a halt to the descent preparation, and over the next 2 hours, they come up with a battle plan that is essentially this. We're going to inhibit the abort switch. We're going to start the engine. Okay, when the engine starts, the solder ball will go to the bottom of the switch. Then we will have a software patch that the crew will enable as they're going down to the surface of the moon. So during that period of time, the control team came up with a technique for inhibiting the abort switch via software. They got the engine started. The solder ball moved away from the switch. They then re-enabled the guidance and navigation control functions as they were going down to the surface of the moon. And this procedure worked like a champ. Alan Shepard, midway through the descent, basically gave an attaboy to the control team. Well done, gang. We're on our way. And back down. Apollo 15 was mission with very steep learning curves for us because we had a crew that was out on the surface for 3 lunar EVAs, and we did not recognize the potential effect of severe dehydration and utter fatigue because we got this crew up into space with severe unbalance in body sodium and potassium. And this led to concerns about cardiac problems that Jim Irwin was experiencing. And we also had one with Dave Scott. So we talk about that in the book. Apollo 16 was another close call because we required 2 steering systems to go through the maneuvers that allows the lunar module to separate from the command module and continuous preparation for descent to the moon. So we had a series of workarounds that we had to exercise for Apollo 16 in order to allow that mission to continue. And then all too soon, the decade of Apollo was over. And Gene Cernan was the last human to walk on its surface. And for us, this was a marvelous time to live because we believed in this dream that we were given by John F. Kennedy, and we considered ourselves privileged and proud to be part of this brotherhood that formed in the early years of space, and we thanked our country every day that they gave us a chance to be part of this great adventure. So the book I've written is a story of mission control. It's a story of a group of young Americans who, regardless of the odds, picked up the challenge to go to the moon. And the principal tools that we use to get there are leadership, trust, teamwork, and the set of values that is represented by the emblem of the mission controllers. And with those values, with those characteristics, we will always assure in our business that we get every crew back, and that failure is not an option. Thank you.
Gene has graciously agreed to answer questions. And Gene, let me ask you then, if you would mind, for purposes of the camera, if you'd repeat it back then. Questions from somebody?
There's one over here. Go ahead.
Yeah, very often working in science and technology on the cutting edge means failing and learning from those failures. And now every perceived failure at NASA is held up to tremendous media scrutiny, and we always hear about the costs associated with missions. And I'm wondering how you see in the future the space program continuing to develop and make strides in this kind of environment.
I believe the question is how do we parlay risk into the equation in the management of our space agency? I believe we become very risk adverse as a nation, and we look at failure as basically something that must be avoided at all costs. I ran a relatively large program at the time I left NASA. I had roughly a budget of around $750 million and about 6,000 people. And when you're managing any project or program, you have to take a look at the schedule, you have to take a look at cost, you have to take a look at requirements, but you also must introduce risk, okay, into this process. Because if you try to virtually eliminate all risk, your schedule's going to stretch out, your costs are going to become enormous, and you're more than likely going to have to compromise the requirements you would like to develop into the system. I believe that the problem with NASA today is we do not have experienced middle management who are capable of addressing when we should accept more risk into our processes in the management of our programs. And I believe it's a middle management problem because I believe that if we could establish the dialogue between upper management in NASA and the mid-level management, and the mid-level management was fully aware, they had the experience of the work they were doing, and they were capable of articulating why we must accept more risk in the programs, I believe this could be accomplished. I believe that any programs that we must run in the future must involve accepting a higher level of risk if we are to keep the costs in bound, if we are to satisfy the requirements and to come close to meeting our schedule. I talked about Walt Williams in the early days of the space program. Walt Williams was the ultimate risk taker. And if you really think about it, here we were starting off, this guy here launches 2 rockets, 2 or 3 failure, and then the next rocket he launches goes through this abysmal process of not launching. You know, our nation was willing to accept the risk at that time because they knew that risk is essential to progress. We must continue to accept risk if we are to advance. Go ahead.
It's along the same lines. As we move into this millennium, the space program seems to be becoming a global space program. And so if you take the issues you just talked about and you add it then the degrees of freedom of more management systems, whether it's the Russian Space Agency, whether it's the French, I just like your perspective on cooperation and managing then what becomes a more organic management system in our future successes in space.
This is a very difficult question to answer. I worked in the very beginning of this Space Station Freedom, which was the Reagan station, and the transition to the International Space Station, which was a part of the Clinton initiatives. I believe it is essential that we keep the political elements of a program in balance with the technical, scientific, and what I would say are the people components of the program. I believe that right now we have a very unbalanced program where the principal objectives are political in nature. And I believe that this interferes in establishing an effective chain of command for management. Let me start it. Design, management, and operation of the space system. I believe it is essential that we maintain the integrity of the flight director's role to take any actions necessary for crew safety and mission success, and that the top-level leaders in NASA recognize there must be an operational person in charge. This, I believe, is very difficult with the Russian involvement that we have with the Russians, because it appears that we're moving towards a more consensus-driven system. This will only work if you've got plenty of time, but even with plenty of time, it may not come to the right answers. You have to leave the technical people in charge, and if I believe there's a flaw in the current planning for the International Space Station, it is that we do not have the technical responsibilities, the very top-level technical responsibilities for the program. That's what I consider bad news. The good news is we have a very competent set of flight directors on the American side, and we have a program director in Tommy Holloway, who was a former flight director who understands the business of management of risk. So at the current time, I think the program's in good hands.
Just to add on,
go ahead.
And I'll let others talk then, do you think that the different presidential regimes change the philosophy? I mean, you're talking a lot about the attitude of and the politics versus the technical people. Does that go with the regime, or is that who has control over that?
Well, you know, space has always had a what I'd say political component. If I'd go back to the Kennedy days, it was to demonstrate to the remainder of the world that we were capable of leading those elements that would continue to strive for freedom. So space always has a political component. To me, the concern is when the political component becomes the dominating component. And I believe that, yes, certain administrations, and I believe the Clinton administration, has used the International Space Station as a political component of the first degree. I have significant concerns about this. I hope that the operational people who currently run the program can keep the political elements sufficiently distanced so that we can do the right things technically. Here we go ahead, right in the middle.
Two questions for you, following up on this one here. There seems to be a very much of a lack of a long-term vision in the space program right now. Two questions. One, if whichever candidate does end up being elected president offers the job of NASA administrator to you, one, would you take it? And two, hypothetically, if that answer is yes, what would your first step be to restore the long-term vision?
That's an interesting question. And I'm not known for my political astuteness here. What I would do is I would volunteer to search for a person. I believe that it is essential to have someone close to the engineering, technical, and the political community. I do not believe I would do well as an administrator of NASA, because I believe the next administrator must be one like James Webb, who is capable. And James Webb was our second administrator, but in the early days, he was the master of building the political alliances that allowed us to go to the moon. So I believe that what you need is some individual capable of building those alliances within Congress, between the administration, and hopefully bridge over into the technical community and the contractor community. I believe a job that would be more appropriate for me might be the director of manned spaceflight, okay, which is really the next level down. But in that particular case, I believe it's someone who's got the opportunity for what I would say staying with it through at least the first 6 to 8 years of the program. I believe that my stamina would take me through a couple of years. So I would really work to find the person who could do the job, and I would work to reestablish the trust within the agency that I believe is essential for getting the job done. Okay. Right over here. I'm running this poor guy around with the mics.
I have a twofold question. In the writing of this book, number one, was NASA, did they express any concerns to you about what you were putting in the book? And number two, what has their reaction been since the book has been released?
That's an easy one to address. The first thing is, no, I had virtually no relationship with NASA during the course of writing the book, with the exception of working with former controllers, flight directors, etc., in assuring the content was on track technically. Second thing is that I had expected I might get some feedback from NASA, but generally did not. I'll tell you one thing we did do is sell an awful lot of them to NASA employees. Go ahead. Oops, here we go. Tell you what, we'll be a bit more progressive. We'll start left, center, and right to keep this poor guy from running back and forth. Go ahead.
Putting politics aside momentarily, if that's possible, are you concerned with the fact that since the first launch, the public has been educated by television and media to see impossible things done with all ease, and to become to expect our people to do things that are patently not possible with or without risk? Is that a factor?
I think, again, this is an excellent question, and it's one that I think must be addressed. I think the Challenger accident really brought home the elements of risk in the space program. You cannot put humans on top of about 5.5 million pounds of high explosive, accelerate them to velocities of about 5 miles a second, expect them to operate in a vacuum with nothing but a couple of thin layers of the fabric of a spacesuit, and have what I would say a risk-free environment. Risk is essential to a continuation of progress, not only in space, but in virtually everything that we do here on Earth. And yes, I do worry that we do not have good NASA spokesmen who articulate this risk every time we put a crew on board a spacecraft. I believe the worst thing that happened in the Challenger accident was not that we lost a crew, or not that we lost Krista McAuliffe, or not that we lost a very valuable space system. To a great extent, I think we lost our guts. You know, if you really think about some of the fallout from that mission, we were approaching, we had 3 principal customers. We had civilian space industry who were putting up routinely 2 to 4 satellites every time we'd launch. We had the military, the DOD as a customer, and we had NASA scientific people as customers. By law, we were driven out of the commercial satellite business, and we were driven out of support for the DOD because we did not want to do anything involving a man that could be done in an unmanned fashion. And I believe this was the first step. The second step was when we dropped the teacher in space program, or the poet in space program, or the journalist, or whoever it is, because I believe that if we're ever to continue going further in space, we have to get the American public into orbit in some role where they can better explain than astronauts do what this business is all about and why we're doing it. We cannot continue to survive without expecting risk, and we must take risk. Okay, we'll try one in the middle here. We'll get you in the back next.
Mr. Kranz, what would you suggest to us all as the next reasonable mission for us to take on in manned space?
Personally, I am, having worked in the early years of space and having worked with the teams and the crews that went to the surface of the moon, I believe that it's entirely appropriate that we moved into a exploration mode in space again. I would like to see us planning on a journey to Mars. But again, that is my long-term vision. In the book, I talk about a document that was written back in the 80s, and it was entitled Pioneering the Space Frontier. And it was done by a series of town hall meetings with some very capable people, Gene Kilpatrick, Chuck Yeager, Neil Armstrong, that established a pioneering vision for America in space in this century. And it was a progressive set of objectives that ultimately got us into the exploring again. I believe that we have a set of goals and objectives that to me is very clear, and I think it is time that NASA builds a plan to achieve those objectives. That's the first step. The second step, however, must be to get people like you, what I call foot soldiers in space, become true believers and go out in your community in every opportunity that you have to speak and carry the message. And the message is that America must continue to accept risk. We must continue to pioneer new frontiers, and we must continue to develop new technologies if we are to survive as a nation and as a leader of nations. So the real first step is to get working level devils in America today out as foot soldiers in space into every media, every opportunity that they have. Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, civic organization, Lions, Rotary, Kiwanis, Chambers of Commerce. Get out there and carry that message that we must go further and do more. There was a question way back over here.
Yeah, kind of following along with that idea, that was kind of my question, but was that the Apollo space program really had the support of the entire country with the president behind it, and there really was a deadline and a mandate. Do you think, is that what it's going to take for a mission to Mars, and what deadline would be appropriate for that, especially with the international community now that we have? Would it take a president? Would it take many presidents?
It takes a true leader, a very articulate leader. As I use the terms, a young, brash, and articulate President John F. Kennedy gave us this dream. We need the equivalent. We need leadership from the very highest level. In order to get that, however, we have to give this potential leader a plan that makes sense, and we must start building the momentum before that leader ever arrives. So I believe that the opportunity is there if we will take action ourselves. And it's really, I think it's going to take about 20 years to get there. I think it's going to take about 10 years to build the momentum and reestablish the infrastructure. There's a very interesting article in U.S. News and World Report, I think it was 2 weeks ago, that really talked at the time of the 40s. We had roughly 4 engineers per 10,000, I believe was the number, in the U.S. population. During the years of Apollo, it went up to 16 engineers per 10,000, and now it has plateaued. At the same time, the demands for additional engineers and scientists continue to increase. So basically, we have plateaued because other jobs, other inducements are taking people away from the engineering and the sciences into other fields. What we have to do is to have some focus that is going to bring Americans into these studies again. To me, it's sort of scary where we have to bring people from overseas into America to pick up the studies of the engineering, the math, and the sciences just to fulfill our own needs. What is going to happen when their country's economies start to boom? Are they going to go back, and we're going to find ourselves with a deficit in capability? We have to find something that is going to get people back into these type of studies.
Gene, we have time for one more question.
Boy, Solomon here. Right here, this gentleman here. Okay.
Very enjoyable presentation, I might add. You specifically mentioned the mission to Mars. Can you contrast that between going back to the moon and maybe doing a permanent base there?
Yes, I would say, and basically I'm sort of a Mars aficionado as opposed to one of these moon people. The reason, no, seriously, I would like to go to Mars because it is going to demand radically new technologies and radically new thinking. We've already been to the moon. It's within our technology today to accomplish if we're willing to spend the time and the national resources to do it. I believe we must, if we're to derive the benefits in America, we must force new technologies to come about. And you really think about how challenging this Mars is. We're going to have to develop technologies that are going to allow us to better use the resources on Earth. We're going to develop propulsion systems. The chemical systems just aren't in the cards for a Mars mission. We have to come up with ways to essentially, and I'm one of those fans who believes that, hey, we ought to find some way to reprocess and derive methane from the environment in Mars. You know, and so basically what I want is a mission that is so demanding, so difficult, it is going to force these new technologies to emerge, because I believe as a nation we're going to need them to work our problems on Earth.
Let me just conclude then by reminding you that Gene will be signing the books in the tent outside on Colorado Street. And let me conclude by sharing with you an observation by Dwight Eisenhower, who once remarked that real heroes don't wear flags. They're simply prepared to stand by respectfully. Our hero is sitting down, but I think the message still stands. So, Gene, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. What we could not accomplish through technology or procedures and operating manuals, we might be able to manage by drawing on a priceless fund of experience accumulated over almost a decade of sending men into spaces far beyond the envelope of Earth's protective atmosphere. All we had to work with was time and experience. The term we use is workarounds, options, other ways of doing things, solutions to problems that weren't to be found in our manuals and schematics. These three astronauts now were beyond our physical reach, but not beyond the reach of human imagination, inventiveness, and a creed that we all lived by. Failure in our business is not an option. For me and for the others sitting safely in mission control, we could only depend on a learning curve that started at a place that wasn't more than a complex of sand, marsh, and new raw concrete, atmosphere of the cabin, creating a fire that was virtually a contained explosion. In those few seconds, the men inside the capsule knew what was happening, and they must have realized at the last moment that there was no escape. We simply could not reach them in time. Now, in Apollo 13, three equally brave men were far beyond us in distance, far out in the vast, absolute world of space, the most deadly and unforgiving environment ever experienced by man. We could measure the distance in miles, but with so many miles, the number was an abstraction, albeit one we had become used to dealing with in a matter-of-fact fashion. Once again, technology had failed us. We had not anticipated what happened back then on Earth. We had not anticipated what happened this time. In fact, it would be hours before we really understood what had happened. There was one big difference in this case. We could buy time.
And we'll take you now to the live to the Texas Book Festival.
Introduce to you Mr. Gene Kranz. Gene is a legend. There is debate in Hollywood about who is more handsome, Gene or Ed Harris. I could tell you many things about him, but I suspect you already know who he is. But let me tell you two key facts. One, he was born in 1933 in Ohio, but he has lived in Texas for a considerable number of years. But more importantly, he met his lovely wife, Marta, who's sitting in the audience, in Del Rio, Texas. Again, I could say much about him, but let me just give you 4 words because they will define the man, and they are Apollo 11 and Apollo 13. Gene's career extends far beyond those two pivotal events in our history. And I am pleased to say that he has taken the trouble to write, and he will read from this marvelous book, which you have a chance to buy after he speaks in the tent, and he'd be happy to sign it for you. This is a bestseller, and it's appropriate and somehow fitting that men like Gene can write a book and can have it meet the standards of the bestseller list when we're in an era when NBA players with their drug addictions make the bestseller list every single day. So this is a true honor. I only want to conclude by saying that Ray Bradbury, a science writer and science fiction writer, once observed that in 1,000 years, as we are truly in space by then, the men and women of that time will look back to the era of the middle 20th century with some envy because we took the first steps. And one of those men who took the first steps is sitting next to me, and so my privilege is to introduce Gene Kranz.
Thank you very much, and it's a real pleasure to be in Austin today at the Texas Book Festival. I feel somewhat constrained here because I normally stand up and I'm an arm waver, so if I seem somewhat reserved today, it's because this is a somewhat different venue than I'm used to participating in. It's a real pleasure to talk today on the men and women of mission control at America's early space program. And before I go into a discussion of our early years, I'd like to read about 1.5 pages of my book. Houston, we have a problem. At some time in the hours that followed that terse announcement from Apollo 13, many of us in NASA's Mission Control Center wondered if we were going to lose our crew. Each of us had indelible memories of that awful day 3 years before, when 3 other astronauts sat in an Apollo spacecraft firmly anchored to the ground. We were running a systems test. It was routine. In terms of the distances involved in spaceflight, we could almost reach out and touch them. Moments after the first intimation that something had gone terribly wrong, technicians were up in the gantry, desperately trying to open the hatch. It took only seconds for an electrical glitch to ignite the oxygen-rich atmosphere